The cold strikes the face like the lash of a whip. On the northern borders of the Roman Empire, winter turned the earth to stone, breath to steam, and bronze into an icy trap. Warriors stood knee-deep in snow, yet on their feet were open sandals. And this was not a mistake, not a coincidence. This was an order not to wear trousers. Why then did the empire, which had conquered half the world, not allow its soldiers to wear elementary protection from the cold? Tacitus wrote, "Neither barbarian custom nor barbarian clothing should touch a Roman." For a legionary, trousers were a sign of a barbarian. Barbarians were Gauls, Germans, Sarmatians, people from the north where the cold was stronger than the law. And a Roman had to remain a Roman even in the snow. Thus was born an unspoken symbol of civilization: bare knees beneath iron. Fabric trousers were called braccae, from the Celtic word braccae. This article of clothing was widespread among northern tribes long before Roman campaigns in Britannia and Gaul. For barbarians, it was a necessity; for Romans, a disgrace. In the legion, trousers were considered almost blasphemous, as if an officer had removed his armor before battle. But imagine this image. In a wind full of icy needles, hundreds of warriors stand in leather sandals wrapped with rags, raising shields on which frost congeals. They march 20 kilometers a day across frozen ground, in bronze greaves and wool tunics, and every step echoes with pain. Beneath their light clothing, their bodies tremble. But Roman discipline allows neither a sound nor a complaint. Plutarch wrote that a legionary must be able to endure any hardship, both the heat of the desert and the chill of the northern wind. They were trained for this. They covered 30 kilometers a day in full gear, weighing up to 30 kilograms. They slept on the ground where ice bit into their backs and ate porridge frozen in a bowl. But complaints were considered weakness, and weakness treason. The footwear of these warriors were calcii and caligae. These were military sandals with rivets, reinforced with iron. They left marks on the ground resembling the claw prints of a beast. Archaeologists found them beneath the Teutoburg forest, where Varus's 3 legions vanished in swamps and fog. Traces of salt remained on the leather, not from sweat, but from frozen blood. Roman commanders such as Julius Caesar and Germanicus knew that cold kills no slower than a sword, but they understood something else. If a legionary wore trousers, he would absorb a part of the barbarian into himself. And Rome built an empire not with swords, but with an idea of superiority, which began with clothing. When frost rose over the camp at night, warriors gathered around campfires, wrapping themselves in cloaks, but their legs remained uncovered. This was a ritual, a test of spirit. The cold turned into an instrument of upbringing. It sharpened the will, as a blacksmith sharpens a blade. And somewhere between suffering and pride, a new type of person was born: Miles Romanus, the Roman warrior. But what happened when the legion found itself at the edge of the empire, where winter lasted half a year, where the north wind could stop one's breath? How to maintain order when the law contradicts life itself? It was there, in the frozen swamps and forests of Britannia, that the story of the first disobedience began, a story that forever changed Rome's attitude towards the cold. Winter in Britannia began not by the calendar, but with the first breath of wind from the North Sea. By the end of October, the ground was covered with a crust of frost, and rains turned into icy arrows that pierced the skin to the bone. It was there, to the edge of civilization, that Roman legions were sent under the command of Agricola, the governor about whom Tacitus wrote. The troops were to hold the border against the Picts, wild, hardened people whose bodies were painted with blue patterns and whose feet knew no shoes. Agricola demanded discipline, but even he could not help but notice how the legionaries suffered. Their leg wraps got wet, froze, turning into icy tourniquets. Sandals with iron studs, caligae, froze to the ground. People woke up with feet swollen from the cold, and yet continued to build fortifications, march, set up camps. In those years, Roman troops wintered in northern Britannia for the first time, and this experience turned out to be a nightmare. Archaeological findings from the fort of Vindolanda near the future Hadrian's Wall show soldiers wrote home with pleas for woolen socks, cloaks, and even trousers. One letter fragment, preserved on a wooden tablet, contains the request, "Please send more stockings and underwear, for the cold is terrible." These lines are not rhetoric, but a cry of pain that pierced through 2 millennia. Gradually, the legionaries began to violate the prohibition. First, secretly, they sewed themselves braccae from the coarse wool of local sheep, wore them under their tunics, hid them under long cloaks, sagums. This cloak became a symbol of the northern garrisons. Sagum, a dense woolen fabric fastened with a fibula at the neck. It did not provide full warmth, but it protected from the wind, and together with the secret trousers, it transformed into a challenge to the very idea of Roman valor. Warriors, raised on the ideal of the severe Italic warrior, now took lessons from those they called barbarians. This was not just an exchange of things, but a clash of worldviews. According to the historian Goldsworthy, it was the northern campaigns that forced Rome to acknowledge the weakness of its tradition for the first time, but no one spoke openly about it. For to admit that a barbarian custom saved legionaries meant to doubt the very foundation of the empire. New elements of equipment began to appear in the forts: leather gloves, fur linings, hoods. All of this was done without official permission, but with the silent consent of the centurions. A centurion, a senior officer responsible for 100 warriors, knew that between regulation and death, he was obligated to choose the lives of his men, and if Roman uniform dictated freezing, he simply turned away. But not everyone accepted this path. Among the officers were those who considered softness treason. They saw a threat in furs and trousers, a symbol that the legion was losing its essence. One such commander, mentioned by Tacitus, refused to take shelter with a cloak during a blizzard, wishing to set an example of courage. He was found in the morning. He had frozen to death, but his face was set in a grimace of pride. Thus a legend was born: better to die a Roman than to survive a barbarian. And yet, beneath the layer of discipline, discontent grew. Soldiers, exhausted by cold and disease, began to rebel. A rebellion broke out in one of the camps in Britannia. Legionaries demanded warm uniforms and an end to winter campaigns. According to various sources, Agricola did not resort to executions. He understood. Punishment would not warm them, and rebellion would destroy the garrison. Then he made a compromise, rare for Roman tradition. He officially permitted the wearing of woolen undergarments during winter. Thus, for the first time in the empire's history, cold defeated ideology. But for this conceded step, Rome paid with a new threat. When the legions returned to the continent a few years later, a new habit came with them: barbarian fashion. Citizens in trousers began to appear in forums and amphitheaters, and senators whispered in horror about the decay of customs. The Senate even considered prohibiting the wearing of trousers within the city itself. From then on, between Rome and the barbarians, there was not only a war of swords, but also a war of fabrics. Every inch of wool on a soldier's body was a step towards the empire acknowledging cold is stronger than pride. But no one realized this yet. Legionaries returned from the north, bringing with them not just trophies, but a new image, that of a person no longer afraid to break the law for the sake of life. And this image would soon change the fate of the entire Roman army. By the beginning of the 2nd century AD, Roman legions had already established themselves on the northern frontiers of Britannia. The famous Hadrian's Wall was being built, a wall 120 kilometers long, stretching from sea to sea. It was not just a line of defense, but a symbol, the end of Rome, the beginning of chaos. Beyond this wall began the land of mists, where winters lasted more than half a year and the sun barely appeared above the horizon. And it was there that the legionaries finally encountered an enemy for which they were unprepared, a cold that knew no mercy. The physical suffering of the soldiers was monstrous. Contemporaries wrote that the north wind pierced bones like a blade into flesh. Archaeologists found in one of the forts on the wall the remains of fires where, instead of wood, weapon oil and even leather belts were burned. Sandals, caligae, had to be tied with ropes so they wouldn't slip off feet swollen from frostbite. By morning, the snow inside the tents melted, turning into mud, and froze again, and above it all stood the iron silence of discipline. Gradually, winter became the legionaries' primary teacher. To survive, they invented new methods of protection. One of them was woolen wraps, which they placed under their sandals. This element later received the Latin name udones, the ancestor of modern socks. At the same time, penulae appeared in the camps, dense woolen cloaks with hoods, resembling travelers' capes. They were convenient for guard duty on the walls and crossing swamps. But no less important was the internal restructuring of the army. If previously the legionary was perceived as the embodiment of a southern warrior, accustomed to sun and dust, now he became a soldier of cold winds. Commanders began to take harsh conditions into account when planning operations. More provisions were taken on campaigns, fuel reserves were created, and heated barracks were built. In some forts, clay pipes were found, rudimentary heating through which hot air from furnaces passed. This was a revolution in military logistics, forcing Rome to admit endurance requires not only courage but also warmth. However, the price of this adaptation turned out to be cultural. The more the legionaries adopted from the northern peoples, the more the line between Roman and barbarian blurred. Tacitus wrote that Romans grew accustomed to foreign habits, not noticing how they became their captives. During this time, fur vests, woolen trousers, and boots, previously unacceptable in urban fashion, became widespread among citizens. The Senate grumbled, but the process was unstoppable. The empire unwittingly copied those it despised. And yet, it was precisely this that saved the army. During the time of Emperor Hadrian and his successors, the northern garrisons were already officially supplied with winter clothing. Trousers, braccae, became part of the soldier's uniform, although officers still preferred tunics. But the true sign of change was the spirit. The warriors stopped being ashamed of barbarian customs. They began to see the cold not as a punishment, but as a test that made them stronger. Centurions were now taught not only the art of drill, but also the art of winter survival. They made sure that soldiers did not sleep on bare ground, did not get soaked in the rain, and dried their footwear by the fires. In the garrisons of Britannia, artisans specializing in fur products appeared, and even traders from barbarian tribes who brought skins and wool in exchange for wine and metal. Thus, step by step, the empire became dependent on the northern lands, on their climate, their resources, their people. Historians differ on when exactly the final turning point occurred. Some believe that after Hadrian's death, the ban on trousers virtually disappeared. Others suggest that Roman pride resisted for a long time, but the fact remains, no northern campaign after the 2nd century took place without warm clothing. The culture of the body gave way to the culture of survival. However, along with this, something else permeated the army, the spirit of the barbarians. Soldiers who grew up in the cold no longer felt a special connection to Rome. Their blood mingled with the local population. Their habits differed from those of Southerners. They became new Romans, not by birth, but by oath. And when, 2 centuries later, the empire would begin to crumble, it would be these northern legions that would play a decisive role. Some to defend it, others to finish it off. But for now, that was far off. Then, in the era of Hadrian, cold was still an enemy, not a symbol of the end. Legionaries stood on the walls, looking at the misty plains where barbarian tribes disappeared, and they knew they had survived what even the gods of Olympus would not have endured. And yet, somewhere deep down, in each of them, lived the thought, if Rome could warm itself with barbarian pelts, then one day it might warm itself with a barbarian soul. A century passed, the empire expanded, but the cold returned once more. This time from the east and north, where Goths and Franks loomed over the borders. Rome was no longer the same. City citizens wore woolen cloaks, officials wore trousers, and old senators grumbled that everyone dressed like shepherds. But on the frontiers, in the swamps of the Rhine and in the mountains of Pannonia, the war with winter had not ended. Here, at the junction of the world and chaos, Roman legions underwent new trials, not only of climates, but also of loyalty. During the time of Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the so-called Marcomannic War began. Legions were stationed in Austria, on the banks of the Danube. Temperatures in winter dropped below zero, and snow fell a meter deep. Trees cracked from the frost. Water in cauldrons turned to ice. And again, soldiers stood guard in sandals, because supplies of warm equipment could not keep up from the south. In the Chronicles of Dio Cassius there is a line, "Many legionaries perished not from the sword, but from the cold." This war showed, cold kills empires no worse than barbarians. To save the troops, the command decided on a step which, 100 years earlier, would have been considered unthinkable. Mandatory winter equipment was introduced: woolen trousers, helmet liners, and fur gloves. From then on, braccae definitively became part of the Roman uniform. But in this practical decision lay a symbolic blow. The line between Roman and barbarian disappeared. Now everyone wore the same. Soldiers of the northern legions already spoke broken Latin, ate local food, and took wives from conquered tribes. Thus, a new class was formed, limitanei, border warriors. They lived on the frontier of the empire, guarded forts, cultivated land, knew the winter routes and local spirits. These were not disciplined citizens of Rome, but harsh guardians of the cold, accustomed to life under snow. In their daily lives, furs, pelts, and wool were not a luxury, but part of their identity. Gradually, the form of command also changed. If previously a legate, sent from Rome, distinguished himself by manners and clothing, now even he donned warm braccae and boots. A legate, the highest officer, appointed by the emperor, commanded an entire legion. But now his authority depended on the respect of people hardened by frost. Those who tried to dictate old orders did not last long. Soldiers despised those who did not know how to survive winter. Historians believe that it was at this time that a new philosophy finally took hold in the army. Better to warm oneself barbarically than to freeze like a Roman. Warmth became a measure of reason. Archaeological findings from the Danubian forts confirm soldiers created entire furnace systems, built stone barracks with floors beneath which hot air circulated. This heating principle was called hypocaust. It was invented for baths, but the northern legions turned it into a weapon against winter. And yet the price of survival proved high. Along with barbarian habits, the legionaries also adopted barbarian freedom. Foreign words appeared in their speech, foreign motifs in their songs. They became more independent, less obedient to the center. When Marcus Aurelius died, many garrisons refused to obey the new emperor, Commodus. The line between loyalty and rebellion proved as thin as that between cold and warmth. In letters of that time, lines are found stating that soldiers began to consider themselves masters of the northern wind. This was not merely a poetic expression, it was a new myth. The legionary now saw himself not as a bearer of Roman civilization, but as a master of the elements. And when the great turmoil began in the 3rd century, it was these cold-hardened warriors who would first raise their swords, not against barbarians, but against Rome itself. But decades remained until that moment. Meanwhile, on the Danubian plains, legionaries raised stone walls, fortified camps, dried clothes by furnaces, and less often remembered that trousers were once considered a disgrace. They laughed at ancient taboos as if at a children's fairy tale, and only old centurions sometimes said, "Once Rome did not know cold," and these words no longer sounded proud, but like an admission of defeat. Was this, however, a defeat? Or evolution, the empire's ability to learn from enemies and grow stronger? For it was precisely those who learned to survive in the snow who would later hold Europe against barbarian hordes. But then, in those winters along the Rhine and Danube, no one thought of the future. Warriors simply pulled on their woolen braccae, adjusted their swords, and went out into the bitter cold, because war did not wait for warmth. The 3rd century. The empire was cracking under pressure, not only from enemies, but also from time. Troops stretched across endless borders, fought in snow, mud, and fog, ever further from the golden marbles of Rome. The center lost power, and the provinces increasingly lived by their own laws. Legionaries who had grown up in the north now saw no difference between themselves and those they had yesterday called barbarians. They spoke one dialect, ate from one bowl, wore the same trousers. Trousers, braccae, once considered a symbol of savagery, became a symbol of belonging to a new northern Roman empire. In the borderlands, Roman camps were turning into fortresses. Stone walls, a water-filled ditch, barracks with clay furnaces, hypocausts. In each such fort, 100 hearths burned during winter. Fire became the heart of the garrison, its breath. Where once leather tents stood, stone buildings with chimneys now rose. Archaeologists found charred wood, remnants of woolen blankets, even fur hoods in these places, traces of an era when cold no longer frightened Rome. But this new comfort had a downside. Soldiers, accustomed to warmth and convenience, became less like the harsh warriors who once conquered the world. Historians like Keegan noted, discipline weakened, and military valor gave way to a habit of survival. Legionaries now built more than they fought. Their days were spent repairing roads, preparing fuel, and guarding local villages. And yet the threat did not disappear. From the east came the Goths, from the north, the Franks. In winter they attacked most often, knowing that the Romans were tired, that the roads were covered with snow. Then the legionaries left their warm barracks and went into battle again. In these battles, frost became an ally of the enemy. Spears broke from the cold, swords froze to hands. Legionaries wrapped fabric around their sword hilts so as not to burn their skin on the iron. To counter this, commanders introduced new techniques. Now, before going into battle, warriors rubbed their skin with fat, greased their feet with oil to protect against frostbite. These techniques came from the barbarians, Germans and Sarmatians, accustomed to winter warfare. Thus, ancient enemies unwittingly became teachers. By mid-century, the army had definitively ceased to be Roman in the old sense of the word. Of 20 legions, half consisted of soldiers of non-Italic origin. They bore barbarian names but swore allegiance to the emperor. They considered themselves defenders of the empire, although their faces and clothing already spoke of another world. Latin inscriptions on fort walls coexisted with Germanic runes, and instead of standard eagles, local symbols appeared: wolves, bears, snow reindeer. Meanwhile, in Rome, there were still people who believed that greatness began with appearance. Senators wrote decrees calling for a return to ancient austerity. One such decree even mentioned a ban on wearing trousers in public places for citizens of the capital. But these words sounded hollow. No one was going to fight the wind for fashion anymore. The strength of the empire now resided not in marble, but in wool and steel. According to contemporary accounts, when Emperor Diocletian reformed the army, he not only changed its structure, but also acknowledged, climate is also an enemy. From then on, winter equipment became a mandatory supply item. Legions were supplied with furs, woolen cloaks, caps, and trousers. The old distinction between barbarian and Roman completely disappeared. Only warriors remained. But along with the practical victory over the cold came an internal weariness. People, accustomed to living in constant winter, found it harder to rise to battle. The empire survived, but lost its breath. Old ideals, honor, duty, dignity, retreated before a simple instinct: to get warm, to survive, to live until spring. When frosty nights fell, soldiers gathered around the fire, warming their hands over the coals and told legends. In these stories, Rome was no longer the center of the world. It became a distant light, visible through snow and fog. And somewhere there, among the campfires, a feeling arose that everything was changing. That the empire, which had created an ideal of strength through suffering, now itself needed protection from its own ideals. But a new winter awaited ahead, the cruelest of all. One that would not bring snows, but would bring barbarians to the gates of Rome, and those who once swore not to wear trousers would now defend the empire shoulder to shoulder with those who invented them. The 4th century. The empire was weary. In the north, beyond the Rhine, new kingdoms were being born, and in the south, in Rome, senators debated taxes and stars. Cold was now not an enemy, but a familiar backdrop, like poverty or death. Legionaries on the frontier no longer remembered that Rome once knew no winter. They knew only service, furnaces, and snow. In these northern forts, children appeared, sons and daughters of soldiers, born under the howl of blizzards. Their mothers were not Roman women, but women from local tribes. Thus the empire dissolved into its peripheries, like iron in fire. From them grew a generation for whom Rome was not a place, but a word in songs. They carried Roman swords, but sang barbarian ballads. At this time, military chronicles no longer distinguished Romans from Gothic allies. The system of foederati, hired barbarians who swore allegiance to the emperor, became the norm. Goths, Alans, Franks now stood shoulder to shoulder with Roman veterans. And in this mixture, that old pride disappeared, which once did not allow a Roman to wear trousers. Emperor Constantine, himself born in the cold provinces, understood. The world had changed. He moved the capital to Constantinople, to where the sea does not freeze. But in the west, in old Rome, the breath of the end was already felt. The northern wind brought not only cold, but also new peoples. When the Goths crossed the Danube, many Romans met them not as enemies, but as neighbors. Some garrisons simply opened their gates, not out of fear, but out of weariness. These soldiers, hardened by winters, saw no point in defending an empire that had long forgotten them. Thus the cold, which once began as a natural force, became a historical factor. It did not merely kill, it transformed Rome into something new, into a world where trousers ceased to be barbarism, and barbarians, strangers. When later chroniclers wrote about the fall of the empire, they rarely recalled the frost. But in every cracked stone of an aqueduct, in every burned fort on the Danube, lived the memory of those winters when Rome first understood: to survive means to change.